All right, we should be all set to go.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name's Esther Anani, and my pronouns are she, her. And I'm a faculty member and the director of the School of Disability Studies. It's my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon and to welcome you to the fourth in a six-part speaker series entitled Sex and the Pandemic. I'm going to open the introductory remarks today with the land acknowledgement. And it's a land acknowledgement that I've offered in the previous panel discussions, but it's still relatively new to me. And as such, I think it bears repeating. So we acknowledge that the School of Disability Studies is on Treaty 13 territory. Treaty 13 is a treaty between the Mississauga of the New Credit that was established between the Mississauga of the New Credit and the British Crown. It's surrounded by territories of Treaty 13A, Treaty 20, also known as the Williams Treaty, and Treaty 19. I'm speaking to you today from the city that's currently called Toronto, and from the university that's located in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and allied nations, in which that bound them together to peaceably share and protect the resources that surrounded the Great Lakes. For those of you who are not in Toronto, this land acknowledgements are an opportunity for us to think about, to pause and think about the territory that we are on, our relationship to that territory, and to acknowledge the history, the sovereignty, and the presence of Indigenous communities. And so for those of you who are not in Toronto, I encourage you to do the same in the places that you call home. While we who are not Indigenous have arrived here as settlers in many different ways, we acknowledge that some of our elders and our ancestors were forcibly dispersed. Some were brought here as they fled for safety. Others were brought here involuntarily or through a matter of violence. And this is particularly the case for those who were brought here as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. We are all treaty people, and we are grateful to share in this land that we call home, in which we work, live, and love together. So once again, I want to welcome our three speakers today and all the participants into this fourth of a six-part series. The series have been a compelling and really wide-ranging look at the ways that sex, sexuality, and intimacy, our understandings of those, have shifted and evolved in current, past, and possibly future pandemics. If you haven't had the opportunity to be part of the series to date, I really encourage you to look at the recordings of some of the past sessions. They are absolutely compelling and provocative and raise many questions that I am sure will continue to unfold today. So the series is brought to us and was organized by Dr. Ricky Varghese, who is the inaugural Tanis Postdoctoral Fellow in Gender, Disability, and Social Justice at the School of Disability Studies. So the School of Disability Studies, for those of you who don't know, really operates from a disability justice and critical disability studies perspective. We offer undergraduate education, but also have a robust history of postgraduate study. And in our work, there are three key pillars to date. One around arts and culture, another around man studies and a critique of reason and rationality, and a third around justice. And I would say that all those pillars have been extended and complemented by the work that Ricky's fine organizing has brought us. And so we thank you, Ricky, for inviting us into this conversation today. And at this point, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for that lovely note of welcome, Esther, and for being here. I want to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to the fourth panel of the Sex and the Pandemic series this afternoon. It's great to be here with you, and I'm excited to be doing this series to you. As Esther mentioned, my name is Ryerson, and my pronouns are he and they. I am the Tanis Postdoctoral Fellow in Gender, Disability, and Social Justice here at the School of Disability Studies, which is housed in the Faculty of Community Services. My own research lies at the intersection of psychoanalysis, sexuality studies, death, and disability studies. I'm particularly interested in tracing and tracking the shifts and changes that have taken place in the history of sex and sexuality. My contention is that every Contagion, the history of sex gets reimagined, reconstituted, and rewritten anew. I believe this was the case with HIV/AIDS, and I sense that COVID-19 will have its impact on how we consider intimacy in the landscape of the sexual. It is with these thoughts in mind that I welcome you all to this series and this panel, and I hope you will find the incident conversation provocative, insightful, and pushes us to think together in a critical and rigorous manner. A bit about how the afternoon will proceed. After all three speakers have given their thoughts, time permitting, I will initiate a brief discussion about between the four of us to get started. After that, we'll open up the floor for questions and comments from the audience. Eric Curiosity will field the questions and present them to the panelists. They will now give a few words about how you can ask questions or provide your comments during the discussion portion of the afternoon.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tally. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the RA for the Sex and the Pandemic series. I'm just going to go over a few access notes, and as Ricky mentioned, I will be on screen later to read out questions from the chat. Just a note that if you'd like to see the live captioning that we have today, please click on the CC button that's on your Zoom panel. So there are a few ways to participate in today's panel. First, feel free to use the chat box to ask questions directly to panelists and to chat with your fellow attendees. Please note that the chat box is automatically set to send messages only to panelists. If you would like everyone to see your remarks, please click the arrow next to the button, the to button, and click all panelists and attendees before you send your text. If in the Q&A portion of the panel you would like to speak using audio, please press the raise hand button and we will enable your microphone at the appropriate time. If you need video on to ask your question, please just message me in the chat. Also, Zoom webinars have a question and answer feature. To use this feature, you can press the question and answer button, type your question into the Q&A box and click send. You can also choose to send this question anonymously by checking that box below the typing area. We can reply to these questions live or in text within this window. In addition, if you'd like to use social media to engage with today's panel, please feel free to use the hashtag #PandemicSex to connect with each other. We are lucky to have Fan Wu with us today. He'll be live tweeting today's panel from the #PandemicSex Twitter account. Thanks. Back to you, Ricky.
Thanks for that, Callie. And so now, without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker for the afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Our first speaker is Damon Young. Damon Young is Associate Professor of French and Film and Media at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the author of Making Sex Public and Other Cinematic Fantasies, which was shortlisted for the ASAP Book Prize and co-editor of the Cultural Logic of Contemporary Capitalism, a special issue of Social X in 2016. And Clear Bonds, a special issue of GLQ in 2011. He is currently working on 2 books, one on queer cinema's theaters of refusal, sameness, transformation, and revolution, and another on ethnological deviations of the self from a written diary through the Instagram. Damon's presentation is titled Sex and Contagion or White Fragility Unsafe. Damon?
Thank you so much, Ricky, Esther, Tali, everyone at the School of Disability Studies at Ryerson for organizing this fantastic series. I'm really, really pleased to be able to participate in it. I've very much enjoyed the other sessions. So what I will contribute today is not a fully worked out argument, but some thoughts in 3 short parts. I'm going to share my screen to provide some visuals. So let's see. Okay. Part 1, Cultural Fantasies of Contagion. I want to approach the COVID-19 pandemic in this talk as an object of cultural fantasy, which is not to discount the deadly reality or the materiality of its epidemiology or the politics of its disastrous mismanagement. But it's at the level of cultural fantasy that I think we can observe some resonances with the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And I say this mindful of the misgivings that some earlier speakers in the series expressed about the dangers of making parallels between these 2 very different pandemics. But I want to talk about a film that came out of the new queer cinema movement in North America that emerged in the early 1990s as a response to the HIV/AIDS crisis, and in tandem with the rise of the academic formation known as queer theory. And this movement drew on the activist energies of ACT UP and other groups, showing how aesthetic disruption can be a form of political action. The film Todd Haynes' Safe from 1995 came out of that context of activism around HIV/AIDS, though addressing it only obliquely, as we'll see. And the film flashes up, to cite Walter Benjamin, at a moment of emergency today, as if it were a time capsule, or what Benjamin calls a dialectical image, creating a constellation of past and present. Multiple pasts. What retrospectively appears as the film's prescience suggests that it is tapped into a larger cultural logic that spans the Reagan era of the 80s, when the film is set, the Clinton era when it was made, and the hopefully post-Trump present, and I'm speaking in a US American perspective here. That cultural logic that spans those decades falls under the broad category of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism inherits liberalism's emphasis on the individual as responsible for him or herself, the individual as entrepreneur, but also the individual as object of never-ending attention and self-care, whose affective precarity is writ large across our contemporary media environments, with their proliferating discourses of anxiety, trauma, triggering, and of course, safety. And it's no accident that the selfie has emerged as the predominant media form of this digital era of techno-capitalism. In my current book project, I argue that we have entered the century of the self. The greatest love of all is learning to love yourself, sang Whitney Houston in a 1985 cover of a song whose lyrics pass seamlessly from an ode to reproductive futurism, I believe the children are our future, to the idea of loving the self in the face of the unreliability of others. And the relevance of this to SAFE will become clear later on. Hypocritical as it may be for a society built on the economic foundations of colonialism and slavery, at the ideal level, the autonomy of the individual is the sacrosanct principle of modern liberal societies. And since we can measure the force of a cultural fantasy through the force of its apocalyptic counter-imaginaries, it's worth observing that the 20th century is full of anxious figures of the collapse of individual autonomy. The image, for example, in Klaus Teweleit's analysis of Weimar Germany, of floods and fluids that threaten the body's integrity and that are associated, he shows, with women, with sex, with disease, and with racialization, all threats to traditional German culture and thus to the nation. Teweleit's two-volume analysis of what he called male fantasies that attended the emergence of fascism is another dialectical image that flashes up in the present context. The Andromeda, I'm jumping ahead, the Andromeda Strain in 1971 imagines a deadly self-propagating viral organism of extraterrestrial origin. And in Steven Soderbergh's 2011 film Contagion, a virus eerily like COVID rapidly propagates, with its origins in China and early transmission in patient zero Gwyneth Paltrow's sexual infidelity. In other words, the imaginary of Contagion captured in that film is one that associates the viral threat to civilization both with the Orient and with white female sexuality that transgresses marriage and motherhood. So these are just some of many examples that demonstrate the cultural circulation of a fear of contagion or contamination that is racialized, marked as feminine, queer in its means of propagation, located at the transgressed boundary of the human and the non-human, and associated with what is metaphorically or literally alien. Pandemics stoke racial fantasies of a walled-off nation, and I'm thinking here of the way Australia refused to let Australian citizens of Indian origin back into the country recently. The threat to bodily autonomy is imagined as a threat of dispossession of the body, home, or nation. And this threat, this imagined threat, activates what Christian Garcia a few weeks ago called a moral economy of responsibility. The death that multiplies during a pandemic is attributed to morally irresponsible others. In this image from a 1980s television campaign, also in Australia, the Grim Reaper appears as an early televisual figure of homosexuality's blackened no future. He's at once blackened and queer in this television advertisement, knocking down white heterosexual families like bowling pins. Such images project onto queers the murderous drive that, according to Freud, is concealed behind every moral discourse. In Safe, Julianne Moore plays the aptly named Carol White, a housewife in the San Fernando Valley who seems to live the perfect life. She is beautiful, her husband is rich, she spends her afternoons doing aerobics, attending baby showers, or working, as she tells a psychiatrist, on design projects for the home. But Carol is afflicted by a series of mysterious and debilitating ailments. In Safe, the good life of the American dream that Carol is living begins to appear deadly, a literalization of what Lauren Berlant called cruel optimism. Becoming convinced she has a form of environmental illness, Carol retreats to a remote facility called Wrenwood, designed to provide a safe space away from environmental toxins. But since those toxins tended to crop up everywhere, Carol pursues more and more enclosed spaces, all the way through to the film's concluding shot, in which Carol, ensconced in this cocoon-like structure, examines herself in the mirror, repeating, "I love you," a retreat from everything outside the self in pursuit of a safety that marks a desperate attempt to regain a lost, but always phantasmatic autonomy. Safe resonates in the present context for several reasons, not least because primary among Carol's symptoms is respiratory illness. The air she breathes becomes deadly to her. In COVID, we are reminded of the air around us, of our shared atmospheric being, which means our dependence on and susceptibility to what lies outside of us and cannot belong to us. The air is not mine, but I can only exist by breathing it. It constitutes an atmospheric commons that, whether we like it or not, belies our fantasies of autonomy. The image of the inhabitants of this facility hauling around oxygen tanks, wearing hazmat suits in an attempt to isolate and purify the air, to detach it from a shared air, reappeared during the pandemic as a potent symbol for a contemporary trouble with breathing. And I recall the early moments of the pandemic in the Bay Area when people would clutch their children and dash across the road at the sight of a passing jogger. Sharing the air has come to seem deadly. Part 2, safe sex. When Ricky first invited me to speak at this prospective series, Sex in the Pandemic, I laughed at what seems to me an oxymoron, equivalent to, say, happiness and student debt, or optimism and family Christmas. This was 10 months ago, 6 months into a lockdown, in which the collapse of the personal and the professional that characterizes neoliberalism was now literalized as the spaces of the private and the professional merged into a single unending space-time continuum of the office / Zoom room / bedroom. Case in point, right here, actually, was my bed right behind me. For some, this presented an opportunity to plumb the erotic potentialities of our newfound technological proximity in distance. For example, Zoom's pin function, which kind of technologizes the possibility of an errant gaze. But for me, the collapse of the lecture hall into the bedroom had the effect of desexualizing both. For those of us privileged or unimaginative enough to have followed a life script that involved attaching our optimism to property, ownership, and the couple form, conjoined, lockdown forced an encounter with the real of the commitments we had uttered in the form of vows and mortgages. My father, who was a research psychologist, once told me about a form of behaviorist therapy that involves overexposure to something enjoyable that is also toxic or harmful, like smoking cigarettes continuously until you get sick enough to produce a lasting physiological aversion. Well, lockdown functioned that way for the couple form. It's like Aladdin's lamp, careful what you wish for. But the unsexiness of domesticity was hardly news to everybody. It is, for example, already revealed in the first minutes of Safe, which introduces us to Carol via a stark, continuous shot on her face as her husband has sex with her. And note the grammatical form there, since the action is all his. No hint of pleasure disturbs Carol's features, only a flicker of almost maternal tenderness as she kisses his cheek after he is finally done. Sex in Safe is another form of domestic labor. In a series alongside exchanging a sofa that was the wrong color or dropping off clothes at the dry cleaner. In other 1990s US indie films like American Beauty or Happiness around the same time, sexual fantasy provides a refuge for middle-class men from the alienation of suburban life. But if desire is at stake in Safe, it is in no way a desire for sex. And I would propose that the film's de-emphasis on sexuality as either problem or solution is one of the things that makes the film so unnerving. While the mythologies of liberalism portray domestic space as a refuge from the instrumental relations of the market, Safe makes clear that domestic space is constituted through and through by economic relationships. Marriage, we see, is an essentially financial arrangement. And the house that turns marriage into real estate is a container for the kinds of labor that maintain it, domestic labor performed by maids, cooks, repair, and delivery workers, reminding us of the fact that in the pandemic, the invisible labor of often undocumented workers suddenly came into view as essential to the material functioning of a society in which they have no official place. For example, no access to healthcare even when they are providing it. Two economies silently coexist in Safe, and in a system that is multiply toxic. But it is on Carol's body that the toxicity plays out, producing symptoms that are both allegorical and material. And in the tradition of cinematic melodrama, the white feminine body becomes the emblem of what Freud called das Unbehagen in der Kultur, the malaise in civilization. Part 3, briefly, enigmatic signifiers. So the reading is more compressed than I would like, but I want to end with a few reflections on how Safe explores the instability of signs in a way that anticipates the contemporary prevalence of conspiracy theory. What if the official knowledges that structure the normal world, for example, the idea that protein is good for you, that saturated fats are bad, that pesticides are harmless, that happiness lies in amassing commodities, what if all these things we think we know are wrong? What if the institutions and experts that define safety, for example, the FDA, the CDC, are either mistaken or deliberately misleading us in service of some unknown, say, corporate interests? Public health crises generate conspiracy theories. John Grayson's Zero Patients explores this in 1993, as does Contagion, the film I mentioned earlier. And the logic of conspiracy finds an ideal ground in contemporary internet platforms in which the authority of knowledge and the empirical status of apparently documented facts are subjected to a corrosive apparatus of resignification. In Safe, the symptoms that interrupt the processes of normal life seem to refer to an obscure truth that needs to be understood. Signs of something awry are inscribed in the cinematic narration through kind of an overpresence of ambient noise, but also, of course, in Carol's body, beginning with the observation at an aerobics class that she doesn't sweat. And the bodily fluids that are here absent later appear where they should not, in a nosebleed or in vomit. These symptoms are material, but insofar as a symptom refers to a truth that is other than the symptom itself, a symptom is also a sign that calls for interpretation. And the film tries out several interpretive keys. The first is psychological. Carol agrees to see a psychiatrist, recalling the 19th century diagnosis of hysteria, linked to specifically feminine sexuality in crisis was imagined to at that time. The second is medical. Carol undergoes doctor's tests, which reveal nothing awry, but finds a doctor who tests for allergies, which are themselves a form of enigmatic signification. The film is structured like a mystery plot, and when Carol discovers the interpretive key of environmental illness, it seems the mystery has been resolved. Safe bodies need safe environments to exist, says Peter Dunning, the guru-like figure who rules over Renwood, leading to Carol's pursuit of an ever more isolated space. Each interpretive framework reveals itself to be subject to fatal forms of doubt, leaving us spiraling within a hermeneutics of suspicion. But in this film about symptoms, the ultimate symptom, and what marks Safe as a film about our contemporary reality, about contemporary capitalism, is that the one discourse that does not emerge is a discourse of the commons. In Safe, the environmental discourse turns out to be inextricable from a moral discourse. The residents at Renwood are exhorted to wear modest clothing and refrain from sexual activity, and to recognize their personal responsibility for their illness. Whatever the sickness, says Dunning, if our immune system is damaged, it's because we have allowed it to be, through a failure of self-love, for example. Thus, every night the residents sing "Give Yourself to Love" in a communal ode to positive affect that masks the ineradicability of what it attempts to suppress: conflict, dissensus, doubt, the hell, as Sartre put it, of other people, but also the hell of the self. As in Whitney Houston's properly epochal ballad, the love that one is enjoined to give oneself to is nothing other than love for the self. And at the end of the film, we leave Carol repeating "I love you" to herself, first and second pronouns collapsed in a communicative closed circuit. Having come to question the forms of knowledge that kept her anchored to a normal world that has revealed its secret brutality, the cure, however, has turned out to be part of the symptom, and in the end, Carol's ultimate pursuit of safety in the tautology of self-love is the very expression of the deathliness that consumes her. Thank you.
Thanks, Damon. Very, very thought-provoking, and I'm really excited to see what happens when we have a broader conversation, and how it fits alongside the other speakers that we have this afternoon. Our next speaker is Benjamin Weil. Benjamin is a PhD candidate in the Science and Technology Studies department at University College London. Their thesis, supported by the Economic and Social Research Council, is a critical inquiry into the progress of the so-called White Blood Ban in the UK. They look at the intersection of queer and science and technology studies, and is also a founding member of the Decolonized STEM Collective. Their presentation is titled "The Coronavirus Citizen, the Privilege and the Privilege of Stay at Home." Ben?
Thank you for the introduction, Ricky, and for organising this series of events, and to everyone else who's been involved in organising it and helping it to run smoothly, and also to my fellow panelists. Damon, thank you for a very fascinating presentation, and I look forward to the next one. So I'm just going to start without further ado. share my screen in the presentation. So this is just like Damon's, a series of thoughts that may develop into something more. I'll see. It's a paper entitled "The Good Coronavirus Citizen, the COVIDiot, and the Privilege of #StayAtHome." So social scientists and philosophers have long puzzled over the determinants of our behaviors. To what extent, they have wondered, are our actions informed by free, unfettered choice or agency? And to what extent are they governed by external social forces or structures that shape our capacities to act? Politically speaking, answers to this question range from rosy to pessimistic. While sociologists like Pierre Bourdieu have considered behaviors to emerge from the inter and intra-actions of structure and agency, queer theorists like Judith Butler have regarded agency as a social fabulation. Indeed, Butler famously postulated in relation to the performativity of gender that the subject that is considered autonomous only comes into being at the moment of the rehearsal of pre-existing cultural scripts, signs, and conventions, such that so-called agency is always already constrained at the point of its emergence. The COVID-19 pandemic has renewed the importance of these questions and thrust them into a public spotlight. Efforts to change human behavior so as to slow or cease the transmission of the novel coronavirus have naturally given rise to national conversations about the ethics of our actions and how they are governed. Supported by the assumption that they are the outcome of sheer freeness of will, certain practices like casual sex, partying, and holidaying have come under particular scrutiny and given rise to the digital pastime of publicly shaming individuals who have flouted the lockdown restrictions put in place to limit the spread of COVID-19. This practice has been taken up online with some alacrity by, in particular, gay men, who have, since the beginning of the pandemic, shared instances of transgressive behavior on so-called COVID vigilante accounts, dedicated to highlighting the failures of certain members of the gay community to abide by lockdown restrictions. The focus of these accounts has been on sharing the names and identifying details of attendees of circuit parties across the United States and Mexico, hedonistic scenes of sex, dancing, and drugs. The founder of one Instagram page, @TheGayRona, told BuzzFeed News that the practice was a matter of, quote, acting ethically and having a moral compass, end quote, and a way of ensuring accountability. In the same article, the artist and activist Leo Herrera cited AIDS history as the reason that this issue resonated so acutely for gay men. He said, "A lot of this younger generation don't understand what it was like to live through HIV before the HIV prevention tool PrEP. They don't see what a lot of our own went through. This is about a group of people and a culture that has already lived through a pandemic. So in very real, tangible ways, we should know better." I agree with Herrera that although HIV is limited as an analogy with COVID-19 pandemic, since the transmission routes, infectivity, presentation, global spread, and communities affected differ markedly, there is valuable pedagogy for the coronavirus moment within AIDS past and present. However, I disagree with Herrera about the precise nature of this pedagogy. For, while he suggests didactically that histories of viral transmission ought to have instilled gay men, but presumably also all upstanding citizens, with a responsibility to eschew risk, in the remainder of this paper, I will suggest that what the response to AIDS crisis in fact teaches us is the highly political nature of risk. Rather than something objectively observed and rationally avoided, understanding viral risk means necessarily confronting the contingent factors, powers, privileges, and ideologies that undergird both the adjudication of risks and their distribution. The practice of online shaming taken up by Herrera and others is the product of a by now entrenched disciplinary mode of citizenship, namely the figure of the good and responsible coronavirus citizen whose behavior is weaponized in an attempt to discipline reckless risk-taking behavior. The construction of a good coronavirus citizen who acts responsibly has in part been the product of a widespread citizen-led regime of peer surveillance and hashtagging, #StayAtHome. Citizens are encouraged and encourage one another to adopt good pandemic practices, to get vaccinated, to wear masks, and to practice social distancing and strict self-isolation in a bid to flatten the curve, so as to mitigate the effects of a pandemic threatening the lives of some of the most vulnerable members of society. At the height of nationwide lockdowns, social media users have shared photos or videos of themselves reading, exercising, cooking, binge watching, and hobbying under the sign of #StayAtHome, asserting their own abstentions and the possibility of a wholesome domestic bliss in the name of public health. Besides maintaining a prophylactic distance from the virus, this disciplinary regime rewards good citizens with both peer approval and the warm glow of virtuous action. Moreover, it affords individuals the opportunity to partake in new forms of collectivity, modes of biosociality or community structured around emergent ideals of civic mindedness and virus prevention. Even Instagram, a highly individualistic social media platform that typically encourages users to craft unique online identities, has gathered #StayAtHome and I got vaccinated stories on its home screen as a way for users to engage with, see, and reward their friends' pandemic practices. These new forms of collectivity can be understood as a soothing extension of solidarity between individuals who have been asked to make uncomfortable sacrifices as a way of protecting others. From an ethical standpoint, then, #StayAtHome might ostensibly be laudable for its orientation towards society's most vulnerable. But the disciplinary mode of thinking that manifests the good coronavirus citizen raises a set of familiar concerns. Namely, it simultaneously imagines and punishes the bad coronavirus citizen as an unspeakable, irresponsible deviant. Just as they are called on to cheer on and facilitate the responsible practices of their peers, individuals are encouraged to monitor and punish those who violate these norms, those who fail to stay at home. Using the #COVIDiot or on COVID vigilante accounts, social media users share examples of bad pandemic practice, shaking their collective heads over reports of seemingly frivolous trips to the outside world, or images of crowded streets or public transport that suggest imperfect compliance with social distancing measures. Crucially, the dichotomy between the good and bad coronavirus citizen is subtended by another, a distinction between, on the one hand, essential practices like certain forms of work, and on the other, frivolous practices like those highlighted by gay COVID vigilantes. Under the prevailing regime of coronavirus citizenship, asceticism, i.e. the moralized, quasi-religious disavowal of so-called indulgence or practices of pleasure, has become the gold standard of disease prevention. With recourse to the thinking that has emerged from AIDS crisis, in particular out of the struggle of queer communities against the double burden of HIV transmission and the concomitant circulation of shame and stigma, we can understand how these dichotomies are deeply flawed. First, the widespread belief that a hardline asceticism represents the most effective means of coronavirus prevention runs counter to the inventive and adaptive spirit of prevention adopted by the gay community in the face of AIDS crisis. In his essay, How to Have Promiscuity in an Epidemic, Douglas Crimp rails against the anti-sex moralisms that positioned gay male promiscuity in the face of AIDS crisis as the product of a kind of compulsion, a pathological inability to abstain. Despite the insistence by gay conservatives upon monogamy and abstinence as the only effective means to mitigate the spread of AIDS, Crimp notes that it was, in fact, a persistent culture of promiscuity that, quote, made it possible to meet the epidemic's most urgent requirement, the development of safe sex practices, end quote. In refusing to cede the personal and community building pleasures of sex, pleasures that were so easily written off as unnecessary by great moralizers like Larry Kramer, gay men were able to innovate strategies and eventually entire infrastructures for a safer version of sex. These insights pose a challenge to the frail dichotomy forged within the culture of coronavirus between essential and frivolous behavior, and therefore between safety and risk. This is not only because it illuminates the extent to which the determination of what is essential and what is frivolous is always contingent and value-laden, but also because, following Crimp, it is only through the continued confrontation and negotiation with our pleasure practices that we might hope to develop something like a vision of safer pandemic practice. In the earliest stages of the pandemic, a widespread faith in asceticism certainly limited the creative development of infrastructures that might enable citizens to safely engage in certain activities. During the first nationwide lockdown, an unexpected spell of sunshine led to people flooding parks and beaches across the United Kingdom, much to the horror of the tabloid press and other online observers. Yet, while reports bemoaned the supposed transgressions of individuals enjoying the sun, none bemoaned the failures of local authorities to prepare for this eventuality and to put in place easy ad hoc solutions like zoning to ensure socially distant sunbathing. The development of such infrastructure is urgent because, as Crimp himself insists, abstinence as an imperative is unsafe, simply because people do not and cannot always just say no, and for reasons that, as I will now develop, are not always as simple as a mere failure of will. For a dichotomy between good and bad behavior is troubling for its shallow reading of either responsibility or recklessness as acts of unfettered agency, and for its disregard of the privileges that facilitate good pandemic practice. Staying at home, for instance, as the hashtag compels, remains an easy choice for wealthy people in harmonious living arrangements, while it might be fraught for others. Throughout the pandemic, celebrities, millionaires, and billionaires have preached about the importance of staying at home from sprawling multi-million-pound homes, sometimes going as far as to share galling images of self-isolation from their super yachts. But for those in imperfect or impoverished conditions, those in dangerous living situations, those without a permanent home, those living with disabilities, or those who have been asked to leave home, staying at home is not only troubling, it is often, in fact, impossible. The good coronavirus citizen then might be de facto people who already adhere to pre-existing norms of family and consumption, who existed pre-pandemic in states of relative domestic comfort and ease. The bad coronavirus citizen, they who are considered reckless or deviant, may often by extension be a queer, poor, racialized or disabled other. Similarly, within certain approaches to HIV prevention, agency is often unhelpfully inflated in relation to risk-taking behavior. In situations where individuals are expected to behave rationally in relation to risk, that is, to avoid it at all costs, those that are deemed to take risks, to be a gay man, for instance, who engages in condomless sex, have been deemed irrational, irresponsible, or reckless. As a counterpoint to this way of thinking, the theorist Kane Race notes that where gay men who have sex without condoms have been figured as intentional deviates, unsafe sex may, in fact, be the outcome of a range of factors, including, quote, erectile difficulty or frustration with condoms, getting carried away with the moment, not knowing how to introduce a condom, being drunk or out of it on drugs, forgetting, an accident, personal turmoil, and this is only the beginning of an interminable list. Accordingly, an approach to risk-taking behavior that overemphasizes individual intention or choice as the determinant of our behaviors overlooks the role of circumstance, contingency, and structures beyond our control. This is among what Lauren Ballant considers normative notions of agency, those that melodramatically inflate both the cause and effects of decision-making as life or death, and obfuscate, quote, the varieties of constraint and unconsciousness that condition ordinary activity. Such a normative notion of agency is highly consistent with the disciplinary culture of the coronavirus moment that we find ourselves in now. Under the responsibilizing imperative to hashtag stay at home, precarious and low-income workers who have no choice but to travel to work are shamed by their middle-class peers who can comfortably work from home. Sex workers who have no choice but to work streets and work in close and intimate contact with strange bodies are shamed by those whose work is contracted or regarded as legitimate, and therefore who would largely have the support of the state if their work was to fall through. Those who have taken to parks to enjoy a moment of sunshine are shamed by those with gardens and the luxury of outdoor space. In addition, state authority is more and more being enrolled to police responsible behaviour, both in the sense that police powers have been expanded in response to the pandemic, and also that citizens are increasingly calling the authorities under conditions of lockdown with concerns about their neighbours' poor social distancing practices. Not only will an increased police presence empowered by the mandate of public health disproportionately impact and concern people of colour, but where individual agency is dramatically inflated, instances of COVID-19 transmission and the violation of social distancing norms will be punished as acts of intentional and flagrant criminality rather than as a product of broader circumstance or necessity. However, there are points of tension in this appeal to structures as the governing force of our pandemic practices that warrant attention. For while many of the individuals who are labelled bad coronavirus citizens simply cannot adhere to these norms, others who are far better equipped to adhere to them violate them by producing and existing in states of exceptionalism. Ironically, as we have seen repeatedly throughout the course of the pandemic, many of those who would otherwise easily display the traits that presuppose good coronavirus citizenship are reported as frequently transgressing the norms of social distancing. Just 2 days after the government and the NHS first issued its lockdown orders and advised people to maintain a distance of at least 2 meters apart in public, it was reported that in gentrified areas of London, farmers' markets and flower markets were overflowing with people. For many of these individuals, this was made possible by existing and producing states of exceptionalism, telling themselves that they do not exist in proximity to risk of COVID-19 because they are young, well, wealthy, able-bodied, and, quote, somatically normal. This behaviour departs from what I have suggested is the dominant intervention of HIV scholarship in the epistemology of risk-taking. Here, agency is not being inflated, as in the case where the bad coronavirus citizen may be falsely apprehended as merely having made the choice to go outside. Rather, from the seat of class privilege, individuals who do have a choice to hashtag stay at home are exploiting their agency, opting to leave their homes for the questionable motive of buying flowers on a crowded street or an overpriced lunch at a crowded market. Others, more vulnerable, may be put at their mercy. And this is my final point. The lesson here is clear. The existing regime rewards those with the most privilege twice over, configuring them as good coronavirus citizens and enabling them to occupy states of exceptionalism. These positions are paradoxically possible simultaneously, as in Piers Morgan shaming COVIDiots from the studio of Good Morning Britain at the height of the UK's nationwide lockdown. It is crucial, therefore, that we distinguish carefully between moments where agency is inflated, for example, where a low-income worker might violate the norms of social distancing out of necessity, and where agency is exploited, For example, where an affluent person chooses to violate the norms of social distancing by making an exception for themselves. Adjoining this softer view of agency with a committed rejection of the notion that promiscuous pleasure represents an inherent pandemic vice, better equips us for sensitive conversations about risk and its contingencies. It allows us to circumvent sanctimony that merely serves to ego stroke, and so to pluralize our understandings of risk-taking beyond a pathological regard for deviant agency. Exceeding asceticism, we can confront the difficult question of how to ethically negotiate risk and safety and to ameliorate the structures and issues, for instance, precarity, low income, poor housing conditions, limited state support, domestic violence, homophobia, transphobia, and so on, that limit agency and therefore equitable approaches to flattening the curve. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ben. That was amazing. I really appreciate your very rigorous class analysis as an old school Marxist. So I was really interested to see that and kind of hear how you unfolded that analysis. So I'm kind of interested to see how it comes up in the conversation afterwards. And now for our final speaker of this afternoon. Our last speaker is Julianne.
The recording has stopped. This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry, there's some issues and that. Our final speaker for this afternoon is Tremblay. Julianne is Assistant Professor of English at New Mexico State University. They are the author of Reading Aesthetics, which is forthcoming from University Press, and the Strombeck, a co-editor of Avant-Garde in Crisis, Art and Politics in the Long 1970s. It is coming out in September 2021 from Sydney Press. Their scholarship has recently appeared, or will soon appear, in such venues as Differences, American Literature, Modernism, Modernity, and Discourse. Their academic and public writing is compiled at jean-bernard-tremblay.ne. Jean-Bernard's thought is titled A Clear Theory of Benign Respiratory Variations.
Hi, thank you, Ricky. And thanks to Tally also for the labor of organizing. I will share my screen. Okay. Before I say anything else, I want to acknowledge the genesis of the Southwest indigenous peoples, such as the Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, who established their guardianship of the lands currently called Las Cruces, New Mexico, where I live and work. I express my gratitude to the area's indigenous communities, including their elders and their future generations. So my short talk today is titled A Queer Theory of Benign Respiratory Variations, and it riffs on the coda of my book manuscript, Breathing Aesthetics. Breathing Aesthetics examines the implicit and explicit theories of subjectivity and community that emerge from artistic responses to what I call a crisis in breathing. A striking recent configuration of this crisis is the asphyxiating convergence of COVID-19, a respiratory illness whose spread in communities of color is tied to environmental and structural racism, and I Can't Breathe, a cry for help turned rallying cry against anti-Black violence. This configuration is a product of the contamination, weaponization, and monetization of air, a process that stretches back to the long history of imperialism, but that has intensified at least since the 1970s. Breathing aesthetics flows from a pair of claims. First, that an aesthetics of breathing, spanning literary, screen, and performance cultures, indexes an intensified crisis in breathing. And second, that the minoritarian manifestations of this aesthetics devise individual and collective practices of survival amid crisis. The aesthetics of breathing may be a resource, but it neither neutralizes nor eliminates breathlessness. Breathlessness is one mode of breathing, not its antithesis. Throughout the book, I lay out tactics and strategies for managing breathlessness. The closest I come to making a prescriptive claim is by calling for an imaginary that accommodates the fullness of breathing, including a range of benign respiratory variations. And today's talk elaborates this concept. I adapt the phrase benign respiratory variations from Gail Rubin's concept of benign sexual variation, developed in Thinking Sex, Notes for a Radical Theory of the Politics of Sexuality. First presented in 1982 and published in 1984, this essay, key to the emergence of queer studies, regards sex law as an instrument of erotic persecution. The state, Rubin explains, intervenes in the realm of sexuality to an extent that would not be tolerated in other areas of social life. Systems of sexual judgment attempt to determine on which side of the line a particular act, practice, or identity falls, and, as Rubin writes, only sex acts on the good side of the line are accorded moral complexity. The sexual stratification induced by moral panics quickly calcifies as social stratification, for stigma renders sexual dissidents morally defenseless. To contest the fallacy of misplaced scale or the burdening of sexual acts with an excess of significance, Rubin calls for a pluralistic sexual ethics rooted in a concept of benign sexual variation. Rubin clarifies, variation is a fundamental property of all life, from the simplest biological organisms to the most complex human social formations. And yet, sexuality is supposed to conform to a single standard. Rubin's hope is that a notion of benign sexual variation would protect consensual acts that are neither harmful nor hostile from stigmatization and legislative overreach. I use the phrase benign respiratory variations cautiously, without implying a one-to-one analogy between sex and breath. In 2020, the shakiness of this analogy was made glaring by the proliferation on social media of comparisons between the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the coronavirus pandemic. As many of the speakers included in the series have asked, what exactly was being compared? Epidemiologists and medical humanities scholars have been right to note that in response to both pandemics, the United States and other governments imposed xenophobic restrictions on travel and immigration, disguising a public health threat as a threat to national security. But other efforts to posit a more direct comparison, the likening of masks to condoms, for instance, have been more tenuous. Rather than enforce a strict analogy, I venture that there exist some parallels between the hypervisibility and violent repression of sex that Rubin witnessed in the early 1980s and the hypervisibility and violent repression of breath in the early 2020s. Within the crisis in breathing, the state claims a monopoly over the interruption of respiration via police violence, environmental threats, and unaffordable healthcare. To generate accessible and accountable breathing publics, we must accommodate and valorize benign respiratory variations and interruptions. The imperfect analogy between sex and breath is such that what counts as a benign sexual variation doesn't necessarily count as a benign respiratory variation, and vice versa. The friction between the two concepts is manifest in Trishulow's description of a sadomasochistic or SM waterboarding workshop, which appears halfway through the 2019 book-length essay, Socialist Realism. Lowe has been associated with the legacies of conceptualism and new narrative. Respiration, as I discussed elsewhere, is one of the objects that new narrative has taken up as it has extended its sex writing practice to different scenes of relation, openness, and vulnerability. Waterboarding is a form of torture in which water is poured over a cloth covering the face and breathing passages of an immobilized person who, as a result, experiences drowning. By giving an account of waterboarding's uses and misuses in the context of SM, Lowe points to the fragile conditions in which it is possible to enjoy a willful interruption of respiration. Lowe begins. We sit in rows and watch as a woman chokes and retches under the soaked cotton of a drenched t-shirt as she has fizzy Mountain Dew drip slowly into her nostrils so the airways can never clear from the sugar. The workshop covers all the essentials: the history of waterboarding in a specifically SM context, what to tell your TSA officer if your carry-on luggage is full of waterboarding equipment, the physiology of oxygen deprivation, how to emergency respond if something goes wrong. The man doing the demonstration is obviously hard through his black jeans. He's stroking his cock with his zipper half open while he tells us this information. Occasionally, he giggles, nervous and high-pitched. His wife burbles under the cloth and jerks feebly before he removes it and spits in her face. I recognize the dazed look in her eyes, and it might not seem like it, but I know she feels delirious and relieved, the world turning green and torn apart as though it were dispensable, as though it were no longer hers. Her knees jerk up. I see the cotton worm its way into her mouth and pucker. Following a digression, Lowe resumes the account. It's hour 2 and there's equipment set out so we can experiment on our own. The workshop leaders watch. It's my turn. I'm no stranger to asphyxiation, and the cool drip of water is starting to make the intensity in my chest burn from the lack of oxygen, even as it calms me. But suddenly the towel is ripped away from my face, an unwelcome gasp of air screeching through my lungs. And amidst my gasping, the woman who's helping me shrieks, "Oh God, stop, you're a breath holder," as though it were some terrible accusation. I'm confused. As it turns out, what makes for successful waterboarding is our body's instinctive urge to inhale when denied oxygen. What makes it so painful is the convulsive gasping that comes from trying to suck in life-affirming air, but finding in its place only damp, suffocating moisture. Waterboarding is no match for me. Years of training as a synchronized swimmer have dulled my urge to inhale when deprived of oxygen. Instead, I hold my breath stubbornly until I can't help but pass out. I don't suffer as dramatically, but it also means that my body doesn't express any symptoms before I move swiftly on my way to permanent brain damage. Most people kick or struggle when they're waterboarded, from the panic, which is part of the enjoyment, the woman explains. But if you're holding your breath, you'll be just as still as a rock. And how would we know? How could your partner know then if she pauses, looking confused? Well, if you're already dead. Lowe describes a breathing public as well as a sexual public. In the SM workshop, pleasurable respiratory interruptions become a matter of collective responsibility and accountability. We may be tempted to perceive waterboarding as it is practiced in this space as a benign sexual variation and a benign respiratory variation. But in Lowe's account, the woman acts as though she were operating with a concept of benign respiratory variation that did not exactly map onto a concept of benign sexual variation. We know that the author consents to being waterboarded, and consent is, to Rubin, an essential criterion of the benign sexual variation designation. We also know that the author finds the experience pleasurable and soothing. The cool drip of water, she writes, is starting to make the intensity in my chest burn from the lack of oxygen, even as it calms me. Yet, the burning and calming asphyxia is interrupted by an unwelcome gasp of air screeching through the lungs. The woman communicates two reasons for cutting the experiment short. First, that Lowe, however much she might have enjoyed herself, did not display the panicked enjoyment expected of people who practice waterboarding. And second, that by holding her breath, Lowe did not supply cues that would indicate mortal danger. Noticing that Lowe's breath holding, an endurance skill that she developed as an athlete, deviates from waterboarding's breathlessness script, the author prevents a respiratory interruption from causing serious injury or becoming malign. Variations in the intensity of breathing say something that consent does not. Whereas the criterion of consent implies individual personhood and presence to oneself, a system of responsibility and accountability calibrated to respiratory variations is premised on the fact of being in relation, or the fact that our ability to withstand breathlessness is contingent on the ways other people interact and respond to the instincts and reflexes that we do or do not display. The principle that animates such a system is compatible with those of the sexual cultures of people with disabilities. As Tobin Siebers writes, being able-bodied assumes the capacity to partition off sexuality as if it were a sector of private life. Deriving parameters for collective life from the negotiation of respiratory variations and interruptions unmoors embodiment and experience from an ideology of private ownership. The system I advocate also matches Stacy Alaimo and Nicole Seamer's calls for a queer ecological framework that values the pleasures and surprises and ethical modes of inhabiting compromised ecosystems. Abundant neologisms have been coined to describe the experience of the present crisis, from ecological grief to solastalgia, to pre-traumatic stress syndrome. Within environments so hostile that existence itself is described in pathological terms, we must generate, through practices of mutual care, publics wherein breathlessness is not fatal. Breathing is inevitably morbid, but I want it, I need it to be life-giving and life-affirming as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. I think at this point, I will have all the speakers come back on screen. So and then and also unmute yourselves. Yeah, I have so many thoughts, so many questions. I want to give opportunity to the audience, but before that, before I ask my own questions, I was wondering if any of you have questions for each other. I'm sure there might be some. there are so many synergies and connections between all of this, all of the kind of papers. So I thought that it's the kind of conversation between yourselves and then.
While I was watching Damon speaking, I was struck by what you were suggesting about the strain that sort of intense periods of lockdown have put on the sort of heterosexual couple form, and how sort of it's tested its limits and the commitments that people make at the point of marriage. I wondered if well, I suppose I just wanted to observe the way that is a slight mirror to some of the claims that I was making, that conditions of lockdown might be more amenable to people who adhere to those norms. And I maybe just wondered if you had any thoughts about the way those two claims mirror one another. I think they are compatible, but they, at first glance, seem to be in contrast or in contradiction.
Yeah, I mean, I very much enjoyed your paper, and I thought that your moving of your attempt to shift the moral discourse to a political discourse, instead of a moral economy of responsibility, as Christian Garcia put it, to a class analysis of the pandemic, which includes the question of who has access to private space, for whom is private space, if that even exists, actually safe, often not for women, not for queers, and then not for people who are living in groups that they have not chosen, etc. So I felt absolutely completely on board with your arguments. I'm just trying to think through what the conflict was that you saw there between the two claims.
Well, I suppose that one of the claims that I made is, well, I suppose it's that stay at home as a sort of order and an instruction seems to, and in fact, many governments, I mean, the UK government is a very good example, have seemed to privilege and give primacy to this sort of heterosexual couple form, and then by extension, the nuclear family, as the sort of, I don't know, central locus of public health and isolation. And obviously the claim that I'm making is that therefore sort of, I guess, lubricates those who exist in those conditions to stay in conditions of self-isolation, whereas let's say somebody who is living single, or as we just said, maybe departs from precisely those family structures, for instance, people who are non-monogamous, may struggle. But actually, I think you've pointed out that is a simplistic, it is already simplistic in the sense that even within that portrait is an image of strain and compromise and frustration, and maybe just revealing precisely how idealized that is in the first place.
Yeah. I guess the moral imperative of domesticity is renewed in a pandemic that, of course, happens in the HIV/AIDS crisis, where remaining monogamous, remaining in the couple form is presented as essential to surviving, and the blame for the pandemic is attributed to those who are promiscuous, those who are having sex on the down low, etc., which is, of course, implicitly racialized in queer people. But I guess in a film like Safe, and I was riffing on my own sad experience of lockdown, somewhat sardonically, but it as you say, those who adhere to those norms, and I guess I was presenting those norms in a more Lauren Ballant-like way as a form of cruel optimism, because we think, oh, what do you do to be happy? You find a partner, okay, you buy a house, you get a job, and even those of us who are privileged enough, and I didn't even mean to include myself, those who are privileged enough to be able to follow that life script, it turns out, the lockdown produced this encounter with what that really means, which is, of course, as all of these 90s films demonstrate, completely horrifying. There's a deathliness and a death drive within the heart of the normative. And of course, that doesn't mean that the normative is not a privileged space. It is, but I guess it's not a happy space, as the film Happiness by Todd Solondz and all of those other films, including Safe, demonstrate. So there's no safety even within the norm, even in the flight to the norm. But I mean, I think the important point, as you say, is that the pandemic remoralizes domesticity as if we need it to be remoralized. You know, it's already, we're already constantly circling in that moral discourse of the family, the monogamous couple, the home, and that it's completely divorced from any kind of class analysis. But I think that that is very much a problem with the current discourses about COVID, including in our own communities who are engaging in these forms of kind of like COVID shaming, as you're saying.
It's interesting to me because, it's not only divorced from class analysis, but it's also divorced from reality, in the sense that reality and class analysis can be like in hand, I feel. But as a therapist, as an analyst, one of the things that I noticed over the pandemic is the other side of domesticity, the breakdown of lots of forms of relationships. Lots of couples coming to actually have to be with one another in a way that they have never ever probably had to be with one another. They finally have to, contend with each other's idiosyncrasies or desires, or lack of desires, and confront the fact that they are perhaps strangers to one another. It's something about the way in which domesticity became privileged in the midst of this pandemic that I find almost counterintuitive to what is actually perhaps happening behind closed doors. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah.
There's almost been a total reluctance to, as you say, reluctance to engage with reality beyond this, this imaginary of domesticity as equaling happiness. As you say, that is an imaginary that serves nobody, because nobody in that space, very few people within that space are happy, and there is enormous strain being put on them. Those who do not adhere to those norms are unhappy because everything is now being governed by this idealized couple form. And so, then I think I come back to this idea of, confronting promiscuity, not in a literal sense of promiscuity, but a broader sort of playful sense of promiscuity, which is what that mean if we were to move outside of the couple form or the family as the unit of pandemic management and pluralized outwards to consider, and I mean, I've seen you talking about this, Ricky, the epidemic as a syndemic of mental health, at the same time as it is one of coronavirus contagion. And that just requires a sort of a profound imagination that, at least in the UK, our government lacks, and public health officials lack for a number of reasons, in part because of strained budgets. But it's something. But
Benjamin, thank you also for reminding us of the resource of AIDS activism in the creative ways that gay men and other queers invented practices that mitigated risk without retreating into the deathliness of the norm or a total asceticism or just the domestic space. And I think that I was struck by that as a kind of suggestion for, like, what if we thought about creative ways of togetherness that were managing risk without retreating into the fantasy of absolute safety, which is, of course, impossible.
And I would like to also add, I used gay men's invention of safe sex as one such example that emerged from AIDS crisis. Another one would be needle exchanges, right?
Yes.
The work of ACT UP New York in proliferating needle exchanges, which I recognize as something else you were gesturing to. But condom use was just one such example of these imaginative responses and refusal to sort of bow down to moral strictures of asceticism and just total denial. This recognition that ultimately people will do, sometimes not as they are told, and again, grappling with that reality is important and not as counterintuitive as public health officials might think it is.
Yes, but I guess I think it shouldn't just be to protect our sexual pleasure, you know what I mean? Like it should be out of an acknowledgement that we inhabit a shared space, that the air is a commons, like that this is a shared atmosphere that we inhabit, that we belong to. We don't own a little slice of the world that you can isolate from other people. So the pursuit of a collective, communal, or commons-based response to a pandemic, which would look, I think, very different from the remoralizing of the domestic sphere, which is so problematic, as you pointed out. I think it can include innovative approaches to sexual pleasure, but it should extend beyond that to the fact that we share the air that we breathe. I mean, here I'm seeing a resonance with Jean Thomas's paper, and I really enjoyed your account. Now I'm dying to read your book now about how these kind of aesthetic practices around breathing that emerge as a response to a crisis, to of course, to the crisis of anti-Blackness and also the crisis of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, if I may just add a few words about this. I was thinking about the long history of such practices while listening to Benjamin's paper, for instance, and the emergence of those practices in Indigenous feminist and Black feminist circles, where it's primarily as a response to the problem of how to sustain radical activism after the 60s, that respiratory attunement sort of takes center stage as a sort of mode of producing coalition and community, and so Benjamin, I'm with you in terms of the critique of so like if the subject assume in a certain dominant critique of the COVIDiot is autonomous and agentive, then it means that we produce this sort of panoptical situation of surveillance and policing where poverty gets criminalized and sex work gets criminalized, and in a really Gail Rubin way, like there is no way of differentiating what it means to just go to work as a contingent worker or to travel, right, as an affluent person. And you pointed that out at the end. But I was also thinking about the sort of like critique of this affluent travel from below, which came from trans of color communities and queer of color communities, where I know in Chicago, for instance, such communities were saying, well, white, gay, cisgender men want to be part of our communities to the extent that they want to be part of it and they want to be able to visit it, right? But their sort of like power of visitation or their right of visitation becomes a life-threatening becomes life-threatening insofar as it is antithetical to a structure of mutual accountability or responsibility, right? So I was like just thinking about the existence of other modes of critique or other vantage points of critique, right? That sort of don't rely on the cult of the individual.
And I actually hearing you citing Rubin and talking about Rubin so much, I'm thinking really the way my paper could be summarized is in terms of trying to move towards a true ethics of COVID, right? Like instead of beyond, as you say, these kind of highly moralized strictures. And certainly I was not trying to enact a defense of gay partying during the pandemic. In fact, hopefully you could see, though I didn't make it explicit, the latter point of my paper about exploiting agency is precisely probably a more comfortable way of understanding that. What I was trying to think through is, for instance, occasions of, particularly in the UK, in fact, we saw sexual health services in the UK stigmatizing, and I've written about this in a journal article in Culture, Health and Sexuality, stigmatizing sex under conditions of lockdown, casual sex. And there's lots of terrific writing in HIV studies and chemsex studies about precisely how casual sex often casual sex and chemsex can be understood as sort of agentic practice, and actually in part they are often the product of a sort of neoliberalizing of the city and the production of the lonely city, and again precisely these situations of social isolation and poor housing conditions, right? For instance, casual sex can be a way of finding community in the middle of another form of crisis. So yeah, I just hope that was clear. I wasn't just trying to produce I realized I started with an account of circuit partying, but I hope it didn't come across the defense of more an elaboration and an attempt to search for a true ethics.
No, absolutely. I was just sort of pointing out something that I was understanding as complementary, and I also read or heard your talk as being about a sort of de-dramatization of COVID practices, right? Like there's such an excessive signification, which Damon was also pointing out in relation to the instability of meaning and safe, that this kind of process of de-dramatization seems to be the first step toward the development of something like an ethics or a politics.
Yeah.
We have quite a number of questions for the audience. I mean, I still have a question that's hopefully we can talk about if you have an end, but I have a question about immunity and immunization. I'm curious about how vaccine will work. But before we end, I think I want us to field some questions from the audience. So Allie will help us with that.
Okay, so the first question I received asks, in the midst of COVID, have you given consideration to the theatricality of borders, but also the penetrability of borders by some? What do you think about the inevitable precariousness of bodies, border crossing and such? I'm someone in a relationship separated by a border, living in different countries, so sex and relations are affected by these politics and access, etc.
Go ahead, Damon.
No, go ahead. If you had something, I was going to just start talking, but do you have something?
Maybe it's more sort of contextual information than an actual response, but I find that question really important, partly because it recapitulates a history of the management of respiration as a management of border control. Chemical weapons have been outlawed for transnational purposes or transnational use, which is to say use in wars, for many decades now, but their prohibition for war purposes coincided with their adoption for domestic purposes by increasingly militarized police forces. And one such weapon is tear gas. And even though you can't use tear gas across state lines, the Mexico-US border, where I live, is often policed through the launch of tear gas, right? And so there's something really literal about this preemptive control of migration through the seizing of respiration that we're also witnessing with the xenophobic policies that have been intensified in the context of COVID.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for your phrase, the theatricality of borders. I think that's very apt. We see how the border is a rhetorical performance in contemporary political discourse, because of course borders are imaginary, right? The fantasy of building a wall that has dominated American political discourse for the past 4 years is phantasmatic. You can't actually wall off a country from other countries. For example, the air transgresses the border. So the border is phantasmatic and it's theatrical, it's performative, it's rhetorical, but we see all the ways in which border, it's also a function of a state apparatus. And even those of us who have had privileged ability to cross borders are during the pandemic suddenly aware of how the border regulates life and its movements. You gave the example of a relationship that's transnational that suddenly faces new difficulties. I've been trying to go home to Australia, unable to go. So suddenly the border becomes hypercharged as a site of anxiety and increased policing, and of course a resurgent anti-immigrant and xenophobic discourse, as if the virus comes from outside. I mean, Australia as an island has closed itself, but even now they're having proliferating COVID cases, which demonstrates that the attempts to isolate the nation really is it can never be successful.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask another question now by Gareth Longstaff. These are questions for Ben primarily, but I'm sure anyone can jump in. Do you think aspects of the good/bad dichotomy coalesce with queer affirmations of casual sex, sexually explicit/pornographic self-representation, risk, promiscuity and anonymity, condomless sex, etc.? I wonder what your perspective is on sexual spaces and sexual exchanges between those we might perceive as strangers and or others that have been renegotiated. I'm thinking of public cruising, sauna spaces, sex parties, etc., and how this might connect to your ideas on discipline, choice, agency, and the good COVID citizen.
Okay. The first point, I'll try and pass those questions as I speak. I think the first question was speaking to in what ways is the good, bad coronavirus citizen sort of constructed around other, I suppose, discourses pertaining to sexual propriety and respectability. I would say that I mean, simply thinking about the fact that monogamy, I mean, something I witnessed time and time again throughout the pandemic, and obviously most of these observations were conducted online on twitter.com, was the tendency of monogamous gay men to sort of, I suppose, shame people who were still using Grindr, for instance. I saw this repeatedly, and again, I think it goes back to that idea of privilege, in the sense of, if you have sex at home, you don't need to go out to find it. And obviously this is going to be totally bound up in the idea that, well, monogamy is considered necessary and life-affirming, while casual sex is something that you can live without, if that makes sense. That is a dualism that is already structuring the idea that one can simply abandon casual sex, and one can claim this from the position of having a monogamous partner at home. In terms of other discourses of risk and safety, I think this is where, I mean, I've written a paper about a very specific HIV prevention campaign that proliferated at the start of lockdown in the UK, which essentially saw and attempted to argue for a state of nationwide lockdown as an opportune moment to, quote, end the chain of onward infections in terms of HIV, which I saw as, again, forwarding an idea of good coronavirus citizenship, which was good gay men should stay at home and stop having sex. And also I felt made a retrospective and retroactive judgment about HIV transmission as a sort of ceaseless link of failures to abstain from sex. That what had happened is what should always have happened was that gay men should have been quarantined, and that COVID simply afforded us, in what the words that this particular campaign used, a window of opportunity or a once in a lifetime opportunity to end the HIV crisis once and for all. So I can see ways in which, the COVID and HIV syndemics have spoken to one another and exacerbated, deeply moralized understandings of sex and transmission. To the second point about sex in and renegotiating sexual spaces, I can't particularly say much about this. What I can say is that I have appreciated where I have seen grassroots campaigns or even public health actors attempting to produce imaginative ways, particularly at moments of lockdown, to navigate and negotiate sex in the pandemic. That has included asking people to move sex outdoors, asking people to use masks while they have sex. As we know, quite famously, I think it was New York City, encouraged people to have sex doggy style instead of face-to-face. Also, glory holes have made a comeback in a big way. I mean, these are all exciting ways in which people have been renegotiating sex. I imagine as time goes on, vaccines will become an interesting biomedical tool for mediating safer sex, particularly as I think we're all aware, there may be lockdowns in the future, and things may become navigated and negotiated in these softer, more nuanced ways. Though, for reasons that we may come up in conversation, I think biomedical tools as a sort of norm of negotiation is troubling in its own right. I think there is a question that we may get to, so I'm not going to answer that right now. Yes, those are my thoughts on the questions.
Okay, so then we'll get to that next question right away. So this one is from Austin. It says, thanks, Benjamin, for a thought-provoking and urgent presentation. I was really interested by your survey of attitudes of the good/bad COVID citizen, with, quote, good being conflated with responsible isolation and, quote, bad being conflated with a frivolous proximity to others. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the recent advent of vaccination stickers or antibody labels on dating and hookup apps. Is this more of the same compulsion to consider, quote, peer approval or, quote, biosociality that you associate with an earlier time in the pandemic? Is this a prophylactic practice that recalls HIV-era safe sex, or is this something different?
So I have an enormous amount to say about this, so I won't say all of it. The first thing I will say is that obviously we could see, for instance, comparisons between pre-exposure prophylaxis and the sort of advertising of pre-exposure prophylaxis and the advertising of vaccine usage as sort of, again, like comparable prophylactic practices enabling safer sex. Both of those have reasons to be troubled in their own right, but for different reasons, in terms of sort of PrEP citizenship becoming a norm in countries, for instance, like the US, where healthcare is stratified. And again, we can do a class analysis of that. When we're talking about vaccines, there are questions about its relation to actual efficacy, who is being protected, what does advertising of vaccine status actually signifies, since we know that while they are somewhat effective at eliminating transmission, ultimately they are about diminishing symptoms and reducing hospitalization. So there's questions there about what this is actually signifying. More urgently for me is I am about to express a very soft sympathy with anti-vaxxers, not people who are hardline anti-vaxxers. But what I do think is sort of drawing on my science and technology studies background, that we do need to understand that the dominant regard, I would say the dominant liberal left-wing regard for anti-vaxxers also couches very normative notions of agency. That is, it understands a sort of denial or refusal to get a vaccine as structured by a dichotomy of knowledge and ignorance. If you get the vaccine, you are pro-science and you are knowledgeable, and if you don't get the vaccine, you're an idiot and you are anti-science and you've simply sought out the wrong sources of knowledge. This is troubling for a thousand reasons, simply because of the enormous and empty faith it puts in scientific communication. It replicates this idea of a deficit model. I mean, this probably for most people here, this is old hat, but this idea that we are simply docile and ignorant bodies that need to be communicated to by science, which is granted all epistemic privilege, and ignores the fact that scientific communication is highly contingent and received differently, and also structured by all those norms that we've already been talking about, right? So let's think about who is being configured as an ideal vaccine recipient, how, and culturally speaking, how a message is being conveyed. Again, if we are existing I think right now we're existing in a society of sowed distrust in the establishment. How then are widespread messages of knowledge and ignorance and sort of anger and hostility towards anti-vaxxers simply helping to precipitate this? Equally, how are issues of clinical racism interacting with vaccine distrust, and so on and so on. So basically what I'm saying is that scientific communication is not neutral, and this kind of privileging of vaccine status, which is often accompanied by this, proselytizing about getting a vaccine and an unshakable faith in science, is uncomfortable and something to be challenged at the level that we see it. I'm talking about when you see it accompanied by messages that simply redouble faith in quote unquote science.
It's been kind of the politician, about the kind of value systems that are mobilized about science and how knowledge gets disseminated, who has access to the knowledge, who is the recipient of the knowledge, and the kinds of relationships and histories that people have in knowledge, especially science-based knowledge. And there's something about neoliberalism, for example, that constructs this idea of what versus that. There's the good citizen versus the bad citizen. There's the good recipient of science knowledge. There's the bad recipient of the instructional recipient, or recipient who rejects science, right? It's really interesting to me that values in science actually how we think about the circulation of knowledge. That build on what Austin's question, but that is something that I had brought up before we started the question and answer, question discussion period. I wanted to hear from each of you a bit about, how you understand the kind of frenzy around immunity, or a kind of cultural frenzy around what kinds of meanings people seem to be investing in a fantasy of immunity. Because immunity is, from a psychoanalytic perspective, it is a fantasy. It's allowed, reality is consequences to it, but it is that, it's a fantasy that is, and I call it a fantasy because it's often mired by all sorts of disparities around access to immunity, like racism, like ableism, classism, and all of that. So I want to hear a bit more about sort of how you can discourse around immunity is going to continue or evolve. There are a very early stages of a new kind of biopolitical landscape that we are in a very new world. And the lesson, you have to provide information in a way that creates a security culture informed by immunity. And so I want to hear a bit more about, what you think is going to happen with this discourse, so how it's going to evolve.
Ricky, that's such a fascinating question. And I'm just thinking of Peter Sloterdijk's work on how immunity and immunology are kind of figures that define the contemporary biopolitics. We're in the age of immunity and immunology. But I like what you say about, in your psychoanalytic perspective, that immunity is a fantasy. Of course, like immunity is never possible. And also, what can you be immunized against? Can you be immunized against homophobia? Can you be immunized against racism? Can you be immunized against domestic violence? Can you be immunized against poverty? So the eagerness with which people rushed to the vaccine as a kind of personal, in pursuit of personal safety, I think is well, now we're seeing, that story continues in that now that we're learning that the vaccines don't provide absolute immunity, and of course everything is relative. So we're in this period of intense uncertainty and ramifying frameworks of meaning and interpretation. And this is also a kind of response to what Benjamin, you were saying about anti-vax rhetorics. I mean, while it's easy to be very frustrated by many forms of that rhetoric because it seems like it's an obstacle to like advances in public health, I think you're absolutely right that we're navigating these frameworks of information. I mean, this is kind of what I was trying to say about SAFE. There are these interpretive frameworks that are based on, that make different empirical claims using different forms of evidence. One of them is scientific, laboratory testing, but then it turns out that's never quite so reliable. You get different results from different tests. So certainty evaporates. And it's very difficult for us to be in a situation that feels personally dangerous, where the body's vulnerability to infection is constantly on our minds. Where we're reminded of that vulnerability, which of course is ontological, but now it feels very like a very present threat. It's very difficult to be among other people who are navigating that situation differently, and it leads to a shaming and moralizing discourse and dismissal. And I hear you. I agree with you that I think that is not, if we want to think about an ethical response to a pandemic, I don't think it involves moralization or dismissal of people's frameworks for making sense of these very contrasting kinds of information and navigating their very different situations in which personal immunity provided by vaccine is only one of many factors that bear on how people are able to live or unable to live. So that was a rambling answer, but I'm just because how do you do anything other than ramble in the situation when there are so many different axes of uncertainty at stake. I'll stop there.
In a way, it's an interesting counterpart to the discussion about the precariousness of the couple form, where like the bourgeois lockdown was like heterosexuality telling on itself, and the big secret is that like men and women don't really like each other often. And now the question is like, well, how does the couple form maintain socioeconomic privilege when the fantasies that organize the reproduction of that privilege seem to be frailer than ever and thinner than ever? And here we have a different kind of fantasy, which is one of immunity that had been diagnosed by a lot of scholars of biopolitics in the mid to late aughts and early 2010s. I mean, I've been rereading work by Jasper Poir and Ed Cohen and Patricia Clough, and there was this desire in the early 2010s to think of virality as a primary mode of political organization, a primary mode through which the body politic understands itself and protects itself. And so, if anything, I think that the sort of pandemic vernacular that has developed has confirmed the idea that there are threats to one's personal safety that are worth couching in terms of viral threats to individual immunity. And so, weirdly enough, like we have a kind of literalization of those discourses, and yeah, that's what I would say.
I don't know if I have an enormous amount to add to those very thoughtful responses. Maybe only that, again, coming back to my presentation, this idea of people living and existing in a state of exceptionalism. I mean, immunity and imagined immunity has been the way in which people create an exception for themselves and were doing so, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic. In terms of people who had the most distance socially from, for instance, the clinically vulnerable, there was always an imagined immunity. And I think, yes, that is going to be a currency that people continue to cash in on, now facilitated by vaccines and vaccine rhetorics, which, as we've identified through speaking, are often distributed, concomitantly with all those norms that we've been talking about. So there's this quite a sinister recirculation, maybe almost like a kind of something masturbatory about the way these norms are being recycled in all of the public health responses and privileges that people are being afforded. But yes, I think imagined immunity is and has been a currency from the very beginning, and obviously preceding that. I mean, in the global north, we've existed in a state of imagined immunity to all sorts of epidemics and other existing pandemics, including the AIDS pandemic, which continues to affect people disproportionately in the global south. So this is nothing new, which we know, but it's bears repeating, I think.
We are just at the very end. So this might be, unless anyone has any final comments or points that you would like to make. No? Okay. I just want to thank everyone for showing up. I want to thank all the folks who attended. I want to thank our beloved speakers. This is a very, very thought-provoking set of conversations. I also want to thank everyone at the School of Disability Studies and the Deaf interpreters and the ASL interpreters, and also my research assistant Ali for helping me put this together. I also want to remind everyone that there are 2 more panels coming up in the series. The next one is on Friday, September 17th. I hope all of you can make it. It's been how it develops. So thanks a lot. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you're signing in from.
Thanks, Ricky. Thanks, Benjamin. Thanks, Jean-Thomas. Thank you, Tali, and everybody else.
Thank you all. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.